much to do how to. You know, if you're starting off doing inclusion work, how would you do it? What are the needs of the young people involved? This copies inside for if you want it. But there was a whole other piece of work that we really wanted to look at, and that was about sharing practice. And it was looking at what is happening out in the communities, where is good work happening, and how can we share that practice with other people. So we started to do a piece of work, and it was around that. We were saying, if an organisation is, at the time we were talking about interculturalism, if an organisation is doing intercultural youth work, what does it look like? So we started to interview people. The Spark Project was one of the groups that we interviewed. And we put it into a 12-step sort of framework, because we thought, how can we help people to start to think about this, to talk about it, and how can they work through some of the things, saying, sort of, have we got this in place, what are we doing? So we then, the second phase of the project was interviewing people using that 12 steps and saying, what are you doing around this area, what are you doing around that area? The steps, they're not prescriptive, there isn't a particular piece of work that gets attached to each one. People do them in different orders, they come in different ways. I don't think there is any organisation that will be saying, yes, we have it all done. By the time they've finished, on one day find they've come around and they say, you know, we really need to visit something. So I'm just going to run through it, because what happened since then was we started to say, well, we've got the 12-step structure around interculturalism. Can we adapt that and use it for social inclusion in general? And we've done several interviews since, and I'm reworking the resource that we have, and it's working really well for looking at social inclusion. So it's very much, you know, taking the steps and just saying, what are we doing around this? What's the story in our organisation? How do we do it, and how do we do it? Other people do it differently. People come up from different ways. So what we've done very much in the resource is getting quotes from people, you know, so it's very much trying to keep the youth workers' voice there in terms of how we're doing it. But I'm just going to run through, because this is about you guys sharing, so I'm just going to run through most of them, and I'll give you the odd quote here and there. So in terms of staff and volunteers, probably a really key one, and I hope you don't mind hearing what you're going to quote you this one. Just in terms of how do you deal with trying to make sure that everybody's on board and everybody's really cool on it. So I went to Belong To, and they were talking about it, and they said sometimes it's about having the youth worker who comes from a diverse background. So they were saying it was really great when we had a Polish volunteer, because they were able to work really closely with the young person that we had who was from Poland, but then they also were able to open it out to the Polish community. And then in terms of the work that Swan had been doing, it was very much looking at how staff can be upskilled and recognising that that can be a challenge as well. So sorry, you do this a lot better than me. So Keir was saying that it's still, to some extent, the intercultural work in particular was identified with certain staff. So they tried to spread it around, rotation staff to work at the international club, so that more staff would be introduced to different ways of doing things. And she says, there's still youth leaders, however, who don't get it. It's the social analysis issue that's difficult. So it's about the way that you lead and you drive things. You have to make things topical. To embed something, you have to keep it alive for all the teams at a particular time. You've got to push it, you've got to name it. So attitudes towards inclusion across all the areas, LGBT, gender, cultural awareness, they can all vary. And sometimes people will struggle with different attitudes, and we will observe that. But staff will park their issues for their work. So it's important to say that dealing with attitudes amongst the staff is alive and on the agenda. So it's that recognition and having that space to keep it there, and to acknowledge when staff are finding it difficult. So there's other groups, and they talk about the training that they do. In KWIS, they have a minimum of 3 days training a year, and up to a maximum of 7, which is a huge commitment in terms of training of the staff. So the other areas, responsibility. Is responsibility assigned in the organisation? really important, exactly as Deirdre says, that there is leadership, that somebody is going to take responsibility in terms of policy development, in terms of making sure everybody's on board, and that constant naming it is happening. So while it's everybody's responsibility, it also has to be somebody's responsibility as well, or a specific team. Activities. One of the things that can often fall down is so busy doing other activities that doing activities around inclusion sometimes don't happen, and we can see a huge difference when people start doing very specific work, particularly around homophobic bullying. There's a knock-on effect straight away where people feel much more comfortable about talking about LGBT issues. So it's actually doing those concrete activities around on the topics of equality and inclusion. Resources. Very much tied to activities. Are you building resources? Are you developing resources? Have you thought about how your resources are being used? Where are you putting your funding? Where are you putting your staff time? Okay. Space and environment, another huge one. What is your space like? Have you looked what it's like in terms of somebody having to walk into that space? What sort of welcome are they, greeted with? Looking at your space and what messages are being portrayed. But the space isn't just the space in which you work, it's also that outreach space. So very much about how do you present yourself in the community. So all those stories come across in the resource, which is in its transition phase at the moment. Networking, I think that was something really important that came across with Deirdre. That idea of linking in with, and you look at this and you'll say, isn't that just youth work? And yes, it is just youth work. But when you look at it in the context of inclusion, it's saying, have we networked with the minority groups around the place? Have we done the networking, like we're saying, belong to? When you need to talk to the people you need to talk to, are you doing that? Participation and involvement of young people, and we talk about that all the time, but are we actually getting the voice of young people from diverse backgrounds? Because that can often be harder to get. So it's just a double checking in yourselves, is this happening? Probably one of the biggest, the organisational review, a real honest look at where you're at in your organisation. Some people have said, you can come up with all sorts of things saying we can't do that because we don't have a disability accessible building, we don't have, we've got a huge waiting list. People can use a lot of things around, like looking at their organisation and saying, we can't go there. It's about shifting that around. There's one particular organisation just down the road, they were saying, we found a lot of people were coming to our organisation and they wanted to do an activity, but it was any activity, it wasn't the activity that we do. So what they did was they partnered up with another organisation so that those people who couldn't take part in their activities or who needs weren't being met, were going to be met. So it's being really proactive about that. It's about the needs assessment that people have spoken about. It's about looking at what you do and seeing who's out there in the community. So in NYP2, they described it, they said, we saw kids, foreign national kids walking past our door, but they weren't inside. So we thought, hang on, we work with people in need, but there must be people in need from those migrant communities as well. What are we going to do about it? So it was go to the school and we talk to them and we tell them, look, we're here. And I think very much like Leanne says, there's a lovely quote, they said, we've no magic to say we can work with this group, or that we've skills around language, but we do work with young people at risk, and there has to be young people at risk amongst this group. So it was saying, we don't know all the answers, but we do know what we do know, and we're going to do this work. And all of them saying, you've got to be proactive. Knowing your community, and if you don't know your community, find the demographics in order to find out who's in your community. Following on from that, monitoring and evaluation speaks for itself. Group contract, I think, going back to what David was saying, I think very clearly that idea of language, creating a group contract that The young people have developed and the young people complete works really well. That's what people have described to us. It's other sister policy, do you have an inclusion policy, and finally mainstreamed, embedded in your work. The sort of thing that Deirdre was talking about. The Spark project is no longer there, but the young people are still involved. So they're just steps that you can start to have conversations around, and that's what I invite you to do.